Hey guys, so today I'm doing a little tutorial flying north from Boulder past Lyons, Loveland, and then eventually going a little past Fort Collins. And I'm going to be describing both the sort of administrative things of places to land and not land and how to stay out of trouble, as well as the general strategy for how I approach it from an XC tactics point of view, and describing sort of the various ways you can fly this line. And I really like this line for beginners because it's got a lot of very accessible landings. You don't end up overly committed or having to do any deep crossings. You can pretty much land whenever you want. The front range by a lot of the Intermountain West standards is pretty forgiving. Certainly, midday air is still something you have to work your way up to. So it doesn't mean everyone can fly this, but compared to a lot of places in Colorado and Utah, this is about as friendly as it gets. The only real downside of it for newer XC pilots is it's relatively technically difficult because you don't have a lot of great terrain triggers along the way. It's got a lot of kind of like flatland type tactics, so it's very tricky, but it makes you a good pilot. And if you can kind of get in the mindset of you're just going to go as far as you can and build your skills over time, then it's a fantastic training ground. I'm doing this on a day that is not particularly good. You can see these high clouds already kind of shading things out. And this is, I think, the third day after sort of a cold front had moved in. So the climbs were relatively weak. It was a pretty stable day. I had a fair bit of surface wind, which if you reference on the map here, you'll actually see a little wind arrow and a strength indicated in kilometers an hour. So you can reference this little map here in the corner of where I am spatially, and then there's also a profile of my altitude and the height of the terrain that I'm directly over at any given time. So without further ado, get started with it. And you'll see right off the bat that I'm struggling to climb out right away, which isn't horribly atypical of Boulder. And basically every time I fly, every time I go to a new site, or pretty much every flight I'm doing XC, I use the first climb as a way to sort of get a feeling for the character of the day, how the climbs are feeling, if there's any tricky layers. And I found that, as usual, it wasn't working very well down low and got better up high. And then you'll see that also these high clouds are really moving in with a lot of shades. So my strategy for the day is to slow down quite a bit more than I normally would and just try to survive. I'm basically hoping that these high clouds will pass or I'll be able to get out into the sunny areas ahead. So you can adapt these kind of tactics even if the day is pretty good if you're new, especially when you have a tailwind like this. If you just circle in light lift, you're making progress down course lines. So if you're new, don't feel like you have to push and race ahead like a lot of more experienced pilots do. Just stay in the game and just keep working it. So I'm going to be flying along these sort of twin hogsbacks, and like I said before, there's not a lot of great triggers along the front range. You're just sort of flying down course line, looking for birds, looking for signs of lifts, and sort of hoping that you stumble into a climb along the way. So I'm just picking up any climbs I can, working with other pilots, and working my way towards Altona, which is this little lake you can see out here. Altona is the first crux that you encounter along this flight. It's where a ton of people bomb out because the terrain gets even lower angle. The wind typically starts to pick up a little bit here. So if you get low, it becomes a real struggle fest. So this spot I'm at just before this little canyon is a great place to try to tank up and get as high as you can so that when you arrive over Altona, you have a few opportunities to find a climb. A couple of notes about landing areas. Off to here is Heil Ranch. The trailhead for it's here. This is all Boulder County open space, and we're not authorized to land here. So you can go over here and look for a climb if you're high, but make sure that you're going to get out and onto the front range before you lose the glide. There's also this little algae-covered pond in this neighborhood here. I'm told that some of the homeowners don't want us landing there, so stay on the east side of 93 if you're going to land, or make it to the north side of the lake. Altona itself doesn't work all that well, but usually there is a climb if you're patient enough. So my strategy is to fly over it as high as I can, kind of fly along this ridge line over the saddle, and then if I'm not getting anything else, start to work along the backside of the bowl, hoping a thermal will pop up. So I'm just going to fly over there and look for whatever climb I can get, and I start to find a little something over the saddle, and I'm not being picky about my climbs. I'm taking whatever I can get, just trying to get out of this lower stable layer and just survive the shade. So I find a decent climb here. This little depression just to the north of Altona can sometimes produce good thermals if you're high enough to exploit it. So a lot of times I'll fly over that area just to see if I get anything. And usually I'll stay over this front terrain here as long as I'm high enough. Obviously, if you get low, it's hard to find a climb there. The terrain's not steep enough to work very well. So if I start getting low, I'll push out more over the flats, trying to be high enough to intercept a thermal. So as we're coming up on the town of Lyons, a couple important markers. We have this quarry here, which often produces a good climb. Just don't land in the quarry itself. The whole town of Lyons is off limits for landing. There's a baseball field and a soccer field that look very attractive, but people have gotten ticketed landing there. So you can fly over here to look for a climb. Just don't land there. I usually don't look for a climb over Lyons. I try to get one over the quarry or over this terrain. On the east side of 36 is also some open space owned by the town of Lyons, which is off limits. Unfortunately, most everything else is private property. So if you have to land, try to land as close to the road as possible, be respectful, and then try to be as low visibility and low impact as possible. One thing to consider is if you're a newer pilot and the day is not very good, this may be a good time to look for a landing because the retrieve is still easy along 36, and there's a big do not land area in this valley. So you're at a decision point of if you're going to go for it, you need to make sure you're going to clear this section. Otherwise, your life will get a little bit more difficult. One good option if you want to split the difference is just to fly east along this highway. I forget the name off the top of my head, but there's a lot of landing options there. On spring and fall days when these fields are less green and it's a little more unstable in the flats, sometimes I'll actually take this front line here and it can work, but when everything's green and wet and it's stable, it usually doesn't work. So I'm going to take this middle line here. There is an option to take a deeper line towards Blue Mountain over this way, but there's a lot of rolling terrain that if you end up getting low in, you can end up in the lee, especially if it's really windy. So I don't recommend going deep bast here unless you're getting pretty high, like, at least 11,000 feet and it's not too windy. But I'm going to take this middle line here and try to get as high as I can before making this crossing. This front ridge line doesn't tend to work very well if you're low on it. Sometimes you'll get a climb high, but often I'll find a climb either a little bit on the lee of here or on this second ridge line here. Or if I'm high enough, the most ideal point is to fly all the way to the back of the Rabbit Mountain Valley where it tends to be a little bit more reliable. So as I'm cruising along here, I'm going to target this ridgeline here, knowing that I would land in this sort of open space, I think neighborhood, if I had to, just being aware of being a little bit in the lee of this small hogsbacks. I do find a good climb, and I have found some of the stronger and more rowdy climbs on the Front Range in this area, so just be aware that it can be very on. Sometimes this mine produces really strong climbs. Right now I'm approaching the Rabbit Mountain trailhead. This feature here is actually Rabbit Mountain, but this is the trailhead. Sometimes this thing produces, and all of this is a do not land area that's relatively highly trafficked. People have gotten ticketed here. So if you do end up bombing out and you can't clear this area, your best bet may be to land on a section of road that doesn't have power lines and doesn't have cars and is obviously safe to do, but that's a loophole some people have used to avoid ending up on open space property. So my strategy here is try to stay high, try to find a climb, And ultimately, I want to get established on one of these two hogsbacks. Usually I end up on this one. It doesn't tend to fire off thermals that are fantastic, but often there's drifty lift and I can work it until I find something. There is a landowner right in this area, just sort of north of this little creek or gully, something by this road, and east of this road that runs parallel to hogsbacks up until there's some obvious property boundaries. And this landowner is not friendly to paragliders, so avoid this area. This, of course, is still Rabbit Mountain open space, which is why you want to get high or be confident before making this transition. I'm going to go for it and get onto this hogsback and just work whatever lift I can, staying on this side of the road until I can find a climb. So as is pretty common here, I find some weak broken lift and just start working along the ridge line, surviving until I start to find a good climb. And actually a bird came and joined me here and helped me work it. The other thing is the day is starting to change character. The high clouds are disappearing, the sun's coming out, the climb's getting better, and I'm starting to think about switching gears here, that the day is now turning on and I can start to be a little more picky with my climbs and flying a little faster. This feature here is Carter Lake, and sometimes you get good climbs along the lake, but I'm actually going to be staying further east because to get out to Fort Collins, it's over here and I have to keep working my way over. And if I wait too long, you can end up stuck in these valleys, which often get pretty windy. And it's very hard to make the transition east last minute, especially if you're not on a high performance glider. So you kind of have to be thinking ahead and pushing east and trying to sort of jump from hogsbacks to hogsbacks as you work along. Something to be aware of as you approach Loveland is there's all these lakes and irrigated fields. So sometimes this stuff doesn't work so well, and I usually fly this little corridor of drier terrain unless I'm getting really high. And so you can see the hogsback's a little better now, where I'm just kind of working this back line and then gliding upwind when I have altitude or a good lifting line to make it work. And just cruising along. This whole area here has very little line terrain, very little in the way of triggers. It's mostly flatland flying. If you get low here, it's very difficult. So this is another section to be quite patient with. I am trying to target these final two hogsbacks that lead towards Fort Collins. Once you get past here, everything dries out and it tends to work a bit better. So the name of the game is just surviving, staying high, getting established on one of these two ridge lines when you're able to. So I start to catch a little bit of lift on the way. The high clouds are starting to move back in, so I'm shifting gears to be a little more patient again. These striped fields often have very good climbs in the area. I've gotten some of my best climbs on the Front Range over here, but there is a landowner that is not friendly to paragliders. So while you can fly over it and look for a climb, don't land in these fields, get to one side or the other onto the road or out around the hogsback so you don't have a negative interaction with him. So you can see everything's really shading out now. I'm still sort of jumping hogsbacks to hogsbacks and I'm getting low. So really, I don't have a lot of options here other than taking whatever lift I can get, frisbeeing downwind, and just trying to stay in the game, hoping the sun comes back out. The dump here sometimes produces lift, but I am not really high enough to make a play to go over there. I'm basically stuck just working along this ridgeline here, which often works well also. At the entrance to Horsetooth Reservoir, often has a good climb or somewhere along this feature rise you approach. So I usually try to fly up along that section and try to pick something up. Usually the closer you get to Fort Collins, the wind tends to pick up more and it gets a little more desperate. This field here, these are great landing options. It's nice and wide and open. You're in an urban area, so retrieve is easy. If you are kind of running out of day or the day's not looking so good, you might consider just landing here for an easier time getting home. I'm going to continue to go for it because I see some cumulus clouds off in the distance, a blue hole, and I'm hoping if I can just survive and keep working that the day will turn on. I still have enough time that going far is a possibility. Unfortunately, I'm not having a lot of success getting very high climbs. I'm just sort of stuck frisbeeing downwind in whatever desperate little bits of lift I can get, trying to fly over possible triggers like this little dark hill here that sometimes produces, but didn't really give me anything today. I'm still at this point hoping that I can find something, but you can see it's getting increasingly desperate. I'm just flying over whatever triggers I can get. I'm committed to this valley. And at this point, I kind of know that it's over, so I turn and land. And you can see that this is the total route overview, and you can really see all these sections where I'm having to push upwind. One thing to note is as soon as you leave Fort Collins, the retrieve starts to get quite a bit more difficult and desperate. So you may want to line something up if you are planning on flying past that, or make sure someone's coming to get you, or you may have an interesting retrieve like I have had a few times. So hopefully you guys found this useful, and in the future I will try to show some of the other lines and ways to fly this. This is definitely one of the more difficult days I pulled it off. So if you can get a day where you're getting higher with more sun and less wind, that'll give you the best chance for success.